Can a visual image, a photograph, or a painting alter our attitudes and perceptions of each other? Can an image challenge stereotypes? Can it communicate a historical journey and help us see humanity in each other? Can an image help us to pursue justice and equity? Most importantly, how does visual representation shape our idea of citizenship? These were questions Dr. Sarah Lewis forced us to grapple with in her prolific course, Vision and Justice, which debuted in 2016. The class was so powerful and so engaging, it was no surprise that it became a core curriculum course for incoming students. It was so powerful and so engaging that 6 fellows in my class, the class of 2017, enrolled in Dr. Lewis's seminar. And often we talked about her lectures for long after they ended. From learning about the earliest portraits of enslaved Africans, daguerreotypes which were commissioned to justify the continued mistreatment and dehumanization of Black people brought here in chains, to studying how Frederick Douglass became the most photographed American man of his time. Dr. Lewis's class covered the many ways a visual image can be used to damage and to liberate. Dr. Lewis is a writer, a researcher, a thought leader, and I would call her an art activist. She has been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Rise, is an LA Times bestseller. In 2016, Dr. Lewis guest edited a special issue of Aperture magazine, which focused on photography and the Black experience. That issue, which also carried the title Vision and Justice, sold 20,000 copies in less than 2 months. It became required reading at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Dr. Lewis is an assistant professor here at Harvard in both the departments of History of Art and Architecture and African American Studies. She has appeared on the TED main stage and on Oprah's Power List. She's served on President Barack Obama's Arts Policy Committee and has been profiled in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and Vogue magazine. She has degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and she earned her PhD at Yale. But besides her scholarship and all her many accomplishments, Dr. Lewis is one of the most kind, most generous, and most graceful people you could ever meet. Please join me in welcoming her, Dr. Sarah Lewis.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's such a privilege to be here. I want to thank the Nieman Fellows that I've had the privilege to teach. You do so much to enrich the dialogue on this campus and have animated the research questions that will populate the book I'm finishing right now for Harvard University Press. So I want to speak today about the role of culture for citizenship and justice. I want to think a bit about the way in which the idea of literacy itself has enlarged to include visual literacy. And I'd argue that we can't do this without considering the historic role that images have played, as Lolly put so beautifully, in both challenging and liberating our notion of who counts in society. She has so summarized the course so beautifully that I don't really need to say anything at all after that. But I'd like to begin to think through this idea by just showing a short 60-minute clip. 60 seconds.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are created equal. That they are endowed by the Creator
with certain unalienable rights.
That among these are life,
liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness.
We, therefore,
the representatives of the United States of America,
for the support of this declaration,
mutually pledge to each other
our lives,
our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
So this is not meant to be an ad for Ancestry. Although why not give them credit for creating this extraordinary piece? I'd like to start with it because of the way in which it uses a visual template to describe this enlarged notion of citizenship today. Here you're seeing John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, which hangs, as it was installed in 1826, in the rotunda of the Capitol. It shows the 42 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence presenting it, their draft, at the Second Continental Congress. But the clip shows the journey between those two moments. Citizenship is defined in 1790 here in the United States as being white and being male and being able to hold property. Is the journey between these two images, in which you see the descendants of the signers of the Declaration of Independence in the precise positions of their ancestors, simply a legal narrative? Or is it a cultural one as well? I think you know my answer. If it is cultural, what are the inflection points on that journey that have enlarged our notion of who counts? Well, this is very much how I teach the class, by considering those episodes. But today, I'd just like to think of the way in which culture has offered a form of data that has allowed us to expand our notion of civic belonging. Now, this is a very old idea, the importance of culture and specifically pictures for citizenship in the United States. In 1861, here in Boston, near Tremont Temple, Frederick Douglass gave a speech entitled Pictures and Progress about this idea. Now, he is being, as I'm told by the president, recognized more and more, so I should remind us, passed in 1895, and he was giving a speech that no one expected about what would have seemed like a trifle in the face of that nation-severing conflict, namely pictures and their importance for the civic imagination. As my colleagues John Stauffer and Zoe Trott and Celeste Marie Bernier have discovered, he is the most photographed American man in the 19th century. Not African-American man, American man. What did he understand about the importance of images for dislodging our narratives, our limiting narratives that contribute to stereotypes about African Americans in particular? He expounded upon that understanding in this speech that so confused his audience that they were silent, but stayed because he was known as a volcanic, prolific orator. As one journalist put it in 1861 about Frederick Douglass, his will, skill, and style proved to nearly all that this is a man who was cut out for a hero. As a speaker, he has few equals. Abraham Lincoln sought out his advice on the subject of emancipation, and he would, though, continue to think about the importance of images. As he redrafted this speech in his study, as I imagine him doing so here in his final home in Anacostia, 3 times over the course of his life. At the end of his speech, he said it might take over 150 years for someone to come along and better explain what I mean about the importance of images for social justice, as we might call it today. And my hope is that the students I'm teaching are those who he had in mind and who he hoped would come. Colleagues I have, such as Deborah Willis, and extraordinary photographers like Carrie Mae Weems, are who he had in mind as well. I'd submit to you today that if we don't fully understand the importance of images for civic belonging as a concept, it's because we often only do so during times of crisis. This is very much the backdrop, of course, of Frederick Douglass's speech during the Civil War. I'd like to just give you another case study about this idea that was also born at a similar time, and this was in 1831 during a period of deep segregation. In Austin, Texas, there was a young boy named Charles Black Jr. who just thought at that age of 16, he was young for college, that he was just going to go to a dance and meet some girls. But he found himself instead just transfixed by the power of an image, It was that of this trumpet player whom he had never heard of before, playing with a kind of genius and lyricism that let him know in that moment that segregation must be wrong. He just knew it. Because if there's genius coming out of the body of this black man, that the entire structure of the world around him must be incorrect. And he stood and knew it, and the friend to his left, who was from the very same high school he attended, shook his head about Louis Armstrong, as it turned out, king of the trumpet, and uttered an epithet commonly used about African Americans during the day. But Charles Black Jr. was sure. And he inaugurates that as the moment in which he began walking towards justice. He would go on to become one of the lawyers that would argue the Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that outlawed segregation. And he inaugurates, and he every year at Columbia and Yale, where he would go on to teach, held an Armstrong listening night to honor the man who created that life-changing shift. How many movements began when a work of art, an image, so shifted our notion of the world entirely that we began to have a different sense of what was possible, more times than we can possibly imagine. Although the Nieman Fellows who've taken my class might be able to imagine it, as they've seen me trot out the various images that give us a sense of this fact. Whether it's the image of the Brooks slave ship that contributed to the abolition of the slave trade, so impactful was the efficacy of an image, not just argument alone, for showing with graphic precision the inhumanity of the slave trade, to many other examples. It is no surprise to me that when we describe the arts, when we describe images that populate not just our museums, but increasingly our pages of either a digital or print newspaper, we often use words to describe that it leaves us changed, stunned, we might say, dazzled, or knocked out. It's often the case that these often private encounters so radically change our notion of the world that we might say without them we could not overcome societal failure at all. Now, just for a little bit of levity, I thought I would show this transcript of Martin Luther King's, which inspired me to consider the idea of art and social failure and justice. This is an image of his transcript from seminary, which you can see he did quite well in class, A's and B's, but he did receive 2 C's, and can you see on the transcript or guess? Public speaking. Yeah. He actually got worse, C+ to C. I wonder what that teacher thought when he went on to lead the nation with the power of his spoken truth and what must have occurred inside of King. But this certainly allows us to consider the artful way in which he crafted, probably with more difficulty than we understood, his prodigious style. American citizenship has long been a project of vision and justice, and understanding this relationship has been crucial for our society. But if I have failed in my talk to convince you of the importance of this, I would just flash on the screen a few images that were commissioned by the federal government, taken by Dorothea Lange to document Japanese internment, but were then impounded because they conveyed with too much efficacy the inhumanity of the then federally sanctioned policy. A year prior, Life magazine had just run this ad to allow citizens to distinguish between Japanese and Chinese citizens to determine who was an enemy and who was not. That is the backdrop against which we have to understand these images. They were being used as a form of data in society, and this image too would have been impounded and was. So just to sort of close, you can understand why I think that it is an understudied aspect of the field in which Jennifer Roberts and I are both a part, of course, art history, to understand this connection between justice and images. And so when Aperture asked me to guest edit an issue, I could think of no more important theme than vision and justice. Without sufficient time, I can't take you through the issue, but what I'd like to offer is an image that constitutes an epigraph. This is taken by former White House photographer Pete Souza, who found himself with the president when a young boy, Jacob Philadelphia, then just 5 years old, wanted to ask his one question that his parents permitted him to the president. And it was simply, is my hair texture the same as yours? What does it mean, though, that at age 5 he needed evidence that he could be and was very much like the president? I here at Harvard teach this material, and there's one person I'd like to close by thanking, and that is my grandfather. I'm named after him. His name is Shadrach Emanuel Lee. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, less cool, S-E-L. It's meant to honor him. But in the 11th grade in New York City in a public school in 1926, he had a question for his history teacher, and he wanted to know why the world as he saw it in Brooklyn didn't populate his history textbooks. He wanted to understand why excellence was always presented one way. He wanted to know where Asian Americans were, where Latinos were, African Americans were, now indigenous, then he would have said Native Americans were. And he was told by his history teacher that African Americans in particular did nothing to merit inclusion. And he didn't accept that as an answer. And he asked again, and he was expelled for his so-called impertinence. And his pride was so wounded, he never went back to high school. He never got a college degree, but he became an artist, a jazz musician, and a painter. And he inspired in me the questions that I'm now, 2 generations later in this country, asking of my students and teaching them. And I think it's an extraordinary statement, not just of what's possible in this country, but of the importance of considering the capacity of the questions surrounding this marriage between images and justice today. Frederick Douglass, I think, reminds us that the arts are not a luxury, not merely a respite from life, but are in fact, in ways that are often unheralded, the mechanism through which we've created the more just society in which we are honored to live. Often we discount this fact because the encounters operate in private. But what is remarkable about the encounters when they do occur is that they allow us, as Brian Stevenson might state, to be proximate to one another. Thank you.